Welcome, everyone. Super grateful and delighted to see you all from so many different places, as we can see here on the chat field. And I want to especially welcome anyone who is joining us for the first time today at Integral Life, to really celebrate one of my favorite people in this integral domain, Dragpa, Lama Pema Dragpa. And I think you reached out to me via email after a video that I had done a couple years ago with Jeff Salzman, and we've been talking and getting to know each other and our work ever since. And I'll just offer the sort of the formal resume-like introduction to Dragpa, and then I'll do something else to introduce Dragpa as well. So Dragpa, for anyone who may be joining us today and who doesn't know Dragpa, Dragpa has been a resident Dharma teacher at the Padmasambhava Ling since 2004. It looks like an amazing community, certainly from the website. And it's the main monastery and retreat center of the Padmasambhava Buddhist Center, founded by the Nyingma Dzogchen masters. You know what? I'm not going to go through the names, but a lot of Rinpoches, whose names are a little difficult for me to say. But Dragpa was ordained as a Lama by the Venerable Khenpo Rinpoche in 2010. Dragpa graduated with honors in philosophy and religious studies from New York University in 2002, and is a senior editor of over 25 books on Buddhist philosophy and meditation. And he regularly travels, he teaches, he's often seen on the Padmasambhava Ling YouTube channel, gives certain talks that are videotaped, and you can all watch them on YouTube. What I would love to just say is that outside of this sort of the resume introduction, the way that I would also introduce Dragpa is that Dragpa is an incredibly committed and warm, serious, but also hilariously funny Dharma teacher. And you are a teacher to me, and you are just the most valuable person, especially in this domain that is trying to bring together two incredibly valuable lineage traditions, Buddhism and, well, I don't know if integral is a lineage or nor a tradition, but integral and Tibetan Buddhism. So I love your heart, I love your mind, and I love the gifts that you bring to this community, and I'm sure your own community up there in upstate New York as well, and around the world. What I'd love to now do is just for about a couple minutes, anyone who is here in this group who knows Dragpa, in one sentence, how would you introduce Dragpa from how you know Dragpa? Go ahead and unmute yourself and offer your own introduction of Dragpa, just one sentence.
Understands the need to be doing our shadow work all the way up into the clear light all along.
Beautiful. Yes, I agree. Thanks, Karen.
For me, it's who is that guy? I saw him a few times, and I had to zero in, had to look at the name. I loved what he had to say in some of the other integral lives.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Mary. Maybe one more.
I just love how Dragpa leads with love, no matter like what. It's so amazing and so present and so warm, and it just reminds me of how important it is.
Thank you, Mary. I saw Phyllis unmuting yourself as well. Were you going to say something, Phyllis?
Wonderful human being with an open heart, an open mind, an open soul, and a magnificent spirit.
Yay. I hope you receive all of that, Dragpa. Thank you. And when Mary was saying love leads with love, I was reminded of something. Anyone who is following the and trying not to follow the US elections, Nikki Haley often says that chaos follows Trump. And I always want to say, like, Dragpa, wherever Dragpa goes, love chases Dragpa, and Dragpa leads with love, and love follows Dragpa. Yes. Well, welcome, Dragpa. So I think that what we were going to do was to start with you presenting to us your work, this incredible labor of love that you have given to the world. And then we'll have a little bit of Q&A, a little discussion, and then to involve all of you, we'll have a Q&A with everyone as well. So all yours, Dragpa.
Thank you, friends. Warm welcome. Thank you, Namali, always.
Dragpa, also, if I may interrupt you just real briefly, I'm also wondering if you can lead us in just a short blessing from your tradition.
Sweet, great. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I can do that. So first and foremost, really thanks to Namali, to all of you all, and to Integral Life for kind of offering this platform for all of us for many, many years now. I've been so deeply enriched by Integral Life myself, and of course, Ken Wilber's works for decades now. And all the people in the front and behind the scenes making that happen. I've really a sincere, very deep, heartfelt gratitude. It's a living, loving culture community of really, really good, beautiful, amazing, trailblazing people with all the delicacies of people, just putting beauty out into the world, which I really, really deeply appreciate and have been really enriched by for many, many years now. So really sincere, thankful. Thanks for the platform. Thanks for the ongoing inquiries. Thanks for everyone showing up. I mean, thank you all. Yeah, so I can do that, Namali, to begin a bit with I thought a practice. I mean, to enter into the inquiry of Tibetan Buddhism, or Vajrayana, and then Integral, they're both very vast, nuanced, sophisticated topics that are really delicate and intricate and complex and amazing, just extraordinary. And so on both sides, Buddhism in general and Vajrayana always begins by emphasizing view or motivation. That's simply put, motivation. So worldview. To activate a living worldview that I'm going to engage life with, whether it's study, practice, experience, relationship, job, that's actually the foremost thing to do as a Buddhist practitioner, is to actually turn on a specific view, to like actually attune to and open up through a very specific lived worldview. And so on the integral side, or Wilberian integral, when I say integral, I'm going to kind of mean that as the Ken Wilber's version of integral during this session. On the integral side, we're also asked to do that in a way, like we have this nuanced, kind of beautiful, intricate meshwork of different all-qual cosmic addresses, of different layers of a stack and lines and shadows and all this kind of richness. And it is always an opportunity for each of us to actually turn on and engage, to locate and be in and through a specific cosmic address. And I think part of the thread that I'm going to kind of be touching on here today and a little bit through this book definitely is to actually try to turn on a turquoise, mature, integral view now. That's something we can do. It's something we can remember to do and kind of train ourselves to do and relax into. And so that's kind of part of the practice I would encourage, definitely for myself and for each of us, to how do you turn on a turquoise lived view? And in Buddhism, to really activate a living motivation. And so on the practice side of that, I'm going to just start then with, like, in Buddhism, a very general thing is Tonglen. It's the heart of the way of the Bodhisattva, those courageous for enlightenment. And what you do is you take on the suffering of all beings, and you naturally, in response, give your own happiness and contentment. So you take the suffering, give the happiness. This is a profound technique that many of you all might have heard. It's been kind of like put out in the public sphere post 1959, now very widely. And it was a secret practice for many centuries in Tibet before that, as a really essential practice of the Bodhisattva. So to take on the suffering, to naturally give the happiness, the contentment, and this follows the breath. So just I'll encourage, maybe we take 5 breaths together. On the in-breath, you take on the suffering of every single being. So we're going to jump into big Mahayana, great kind of vehicle path view here. For all beings are suffering. Every single one of us is kind of constantly aching. There's an uncertainty with what's going to happen next, with sustaining the joy we have. There's always this uncertainty. It's a fundamental tension of knowing that this conditionality is always moving. And that's distressing. So on the in-breath, I naturally take the distress, the suffering, the dissatisfaction, the fear, the kind of really ache of all beings. And as it comes into me, it naturally kind of touches my own goodness, my own courageous, beautiful, natural, pristine awareness. And that kind of tension, that suffering instantly transforms into fuel for my own nature to shine even more brightly, more beautifully, more lovingly, more connectedly. And on the out-breath, that goes out to every single being instantaneously as whatever they need to be supported, uplifted, comforted, protected, healed, encouraged, seen. So this happiness reaches them exactly in the way that is helpful for them. And on the in-breath, we take their discomfort. And on the out-breath, we offer them whatever comforts, uplifts, and ultimately liberates them from all causes of suffering. So we'll just do that with 5 breaths or so, more focusing on the view that we're maintaining as aside from a certain visualization. You just naturally kind of let your breath come in and out, kind of hold that few breaths. Thank you. So this is a lived worldview. Ken Wilber said, everything comes from a perspective. And Buddhism says everything begins with a view. And so this is in particular Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhist kind of topic that's being explored today. So I'll recite this lineage prayer to Guru Padmasambhava, which is very short, the 7-line prayer of Guru Rinpoche. I'll recite this 3 times, connecting to Guru Rinpoche and all the wisdom beings, the great noble ones, overflowing with compassion for all beings. They fully actualized and stabilized this experience, this view, this worldview. They're like, it's always on for them. The living experience of constantly serving all beings attuned exactly, exquisitely with detail to what actually would support each being. So I'll recite this prayer to Guru Rinpoche and all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, Arhats, all the wisdom beings of all kinds throughout the entire universe. Kind of really connecting with them and like actually asking for their support to have this inquiry be very generative, very blossoming, very beautiful, nutritious for all beings. So Om Ujin 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 Sam Pema Geza Dumbo La Yazin Jugid Nundun Pema Jinne Jisu Dra Kodu Kadro Mampo Ko Jiji Jisu Dabdub Ji Jinji Lobji Jisu So Guru Pema Zide Hong Om Ujin 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 Sam Pema Geza Dumbo La Yazin Jugid Nundun Pema Jinne Jisu Dra Kodu Kadro Mampo Ko Jiji Jisu Dabdub Ji Jinji Lobji Jisu So Guru Pema Zide Hong Hung Ujin 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 Sam Pema Geza Dumbo La Yazin Jugid Nundun Pema Jinne Jisu Dra Kodu Kadro Mampo Ko Jiji Jisu Dabdub Ji Jinji Lobji Jisu So Guru Pema Zide Hong. It's all in the prep. Sometimes we think, why all the extra setting up at the beginning? Why to create an atmosphere? Why to take the time? Let's get to the meat of the information. But the view makes all the difference. The worldview makes all the difference. What cosmic address we're coming from? Where is our heart? Where is our mind? This makes all the difference with how we'll be with the information, or how we'll be with the lived experience. So like this is always the vital, important first step to really intentionally kind of open into a specific perspective that we want to be in, that we want to interpret through. And so for Buddhists, that's always the first step. Activate the view, the lived experience, whether it's conceptual or post-conceptual. And so that's step one. And so, but here we'll just begin, like this is a big book I wrote. And it's, in one ways, like it's like a love letter to Buddhism and a love letter to Integral. And it's a big fat 800-page something book. And I was looking at it today, and I hadn't looked at it in a little bit. And I was happy with it. I was like, oh, I've offered something here that like really honors these things I've received as best as I could. I was really happy. And I wanted to jump to the end because, 800 pages in our information overload, juggling, collapsing, exhaustion time. 800 pages is almost like the best way to have someone not open a book. Or anything. It's just too much. So I thought to jump to the end. Page 796, and the chapter is what it all comes down to. And it's just really short. When all the theoretical distinctions and super fine-tuning are said and done, it really comes down to some simple questions. How soft and caring is my heart? How willing am I to really look at my beliefs and admit my limitations? How interested am I in trying to see things from other people's perspectives? How much do I believe in the deep goodness of myself and others? How open am I to be moved by the world? How able am I to not be crushed by it? And that's what this book is kind of addressing. I've found in my experience that definitely for myself and for a lot of people I've met, sometimes overshooting beyond kind of all the nitty-gritty weeds is actually a more practical way to engage things. So to start with the poetry, to start with the kind of the hook, or like, I put it more to myself. We all love falling in love. To be swept away by something, whether it's music, food, a person, a place, community, a technique. We love kind of in one way surrendering to something that we really feel connected with. And all of a sudden we let ourselves, it's like this immediate trust where we let ourselves sync up with all these living threads and dynamics of this very vast web of experience, of atmosphere, of a person, of a place, of a taste. And we surrender, we suspend our disbelief, and we let ourselves just really actively learn and soak things up. And without kind of overshooting into that and like creating, what's the poetic, kind of relaxed, interesting kind of, place of being vulnerable and curious. Like all the instruction manuals and mechanics basically aren't interesting to most of us. If we don't have that initial hook, if we don't really love a movie, we're not going to really be interested in learning all the background information and who did what and how much it cost and all that. It just becomes irrelevant right off the bat. And so we need this hook to fall in love, but oftentimes, like something as nuanced as integral or as Tibetan Buddhism, it can be reductionist. We need to be swept away, but we need to be willing to really do some of the chewing work, the digestive work of really being with it over a long period of time, because they're so rich, these living ecologies. And so this big book basically had 4 principal audiences: people interested in Tibetan Buddhism, both new people and older, more seasoned people that have studied and practiced for longer. And then for integralists, Wilberian integralists, people who are newly interested in integral, and people who've been interested and actively working with it for some time. So these are the 4 audiences that I'm trying to actually engage with this book. And then we have different learning styles, right? So it's kind of a big lift. So it's a big book to jump around in. They're big topics. We can approach them from different levels of kind of experience with different reasons to be interested in them. So that's all to say, like, it's even more complex than just saying, how do these 2 vast topics fit together, integral and Vajrayana Buddhism? But for the integralists, I think a principal challenge that I'm offering, and that I'm offering to myself too, is if we only hang out in teal map making, in conceptual system correlating, if we only get really good at seeing how different maps and systems sync up and meet up, but we always hold it at a safe distance from ourselves, and we don't really vulnerably let ourselves be in the rich ecology of actual systems syncing up, like with on the ground, rooted, lived local personal experience. If we don't do that, we will basically be preventing ourselves from growing into turquoise. Not just as a map that we hold and can, like, there's a lot of beauty in holding a map and connecting dots in ways that are very clarifying, but to really apply that in lived experience as it's happening. That's much more into the more maturing integral or the turquoise level in spiral dynamics terms. And then for Buddhists, so that's part of this challenge. I think what all these very complex meta crises in the world are demanding right now, in a lot of ways, is for us to live this, to live integral. One, to understand it rationally, cognitively, according to logic and IQ and all that. That's super important. But also to really live it in real time with the people we're around in our local surroundings. And so Buddhism talks about this as the way of the Bodhisattva. And this is Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle, which is foundational, or the heart of Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism. The way of the Bodhisattva. And from my little experience with Buddhism, I've lived at this retreat center with Venerable Khenpo Rinpoche's for some 20 years now. Just as a student, learning, like very simply learning. I'm actively just learning and making all kinds of mistakes. But in my little experience, I don't think it's possible to practice Tibetan Buddhism in a pre-integral way, and to completely follow the teachings of the Buddha. So said in another way, I think you have to approach Tibetan Buddhism integrally in order to actually follow the teachings of the Buddha in terms of how he's teaching Tibetan Buddhism. And then we can zoom out and use some integral jargon and spiral dynamics to like highlight what does that mean. I think the Buddha really clearly did in Theravada tradition, the foundation of Buddhism, Mahayana and Vajrayana, very clearly identified negative aspects of pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and post-postmodern or integral, the limitations we need to avoid or transcend. And Buddha Shakyamuni, this is 2,600 years ago, also very clearly identified the positive, healthy aspects of pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and post-postmodern aspects of any moment of experience that we need to include. And this was done in the Theravada foundation teachings. And that's a function of an integral worldview. Only an integral worldview will try to take that perspective, where you're trying to include all the valuable aspects of these stages, at least, as just one example, and you're trying to transcend the limitations of those respective stages as well. That's a function of an integral worldview. And Ken Wilber agrees with this. He's said in different places, publicly and in books, that Tibetan Buddhism is one of the most integral systems that he's ever seen throughout all of his studies. And he's obviously done a lot of study. What an amazing genius. What an amazing meta mapper Ken Wilber is. Just extraordinary. And there's always the healthy and. I think if we only go as far as taking a certain teal approach, a certain map-making approach to Tibetan Buddhism, when we look at some of the more nuanced, subtle relative truth aspects or the more esoteric aspects, we'll actually break living lineage tradition. We'll break a lot of the lineage beauty and wisdom. And so I think there's a very healthy cautionary pause there. And that can be explained very delicately and with detail and very generally and broadly, and the time constraints are as it is right now, very broadly. That in Buddhist terms, Zen is not the same as Dzogchen. Zen is not the same as Dzogchen. So to recognize the emptiness or the open flexibility of mind and of all things, of all apparent things, their utterly interdependent relational nature, that's called emptiness in Buddhism, as a lived experience. So this is Zen mind, beginner's mind. This is key and utterly important. This is called emptiness. It's so vitally important in Buddhism and all the levels of Buddhist teaching. And in addition, there's the relative truth side. And that relative truth side has an impure side, or how a mistaken, kind of contracted, ignorant, kind of locked up duality being like me, how we see things, how I see things, compared with how an enlightened being or a really awakened being would experience things, like a high-level bodhisattva or a Buddha. And that's called pure relative truth. So Buddhism from Mahayana and up into Vajrayana always defines these two: impure relative truth, pure relative truth. And pure relative truth, they both always have three things: body, speech, mind. There's body and speech and mind. Every single sentient being has these three things. And when we see body, speech, and mind purely, Tibetan Buddhism calls that pure body, calls it deity. Pure speech is called mantra. Pure mind is called dharmakaya, or wisdom. And so Zen and Dzogchen both include this pure mind, dharmakaya, or wisdom. But Zen doesn't yet include pure body and pure speech, or deity and mantra. Tibetan Buddhism does. And so what we see is that if we only think enlightenment is pure mind, and then we think In Buddhism, this is level 3. So there's a lot of intricacy here that I don't have time to go into. Zen, so amazing. This is level 3. It goes up 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 is Dzogchen or Mahamudra. These very high level teachings usually talked about as non-duality. All the interim between Zen 3 into 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the key distinction is pure relative truth. Also integrating deity and mantra with pure mind or wisdom. That's the distinguishing factor. And then doing that skillfully with actively using our body and our speech and our mind to fully integrate all body, all speech, and all mind, both the pure parts and the impure parts. So this is an up-leveled integral move. It's more integrative. And so that is something that has to happen in Tibetan Buddhism according to Tibetan Buddhist view, to integrate this pure body and pure speech. But I find what's happened in a lot of circles, not just integral, but a lot of them, is we typically see anything that looks like a deity or mantra, and we throw it into a pre-modern bucket, as if it's all just fairies and goblins and Santa Clauses and hocus pocus, magic, superpower, child, Saturday morning cartoon stories. Like it's all just childish projection. And so that I think we should really look at with great pause. Because wisdom traditions, a lot of them have located these kind of more subtle aspects, and I'm not saying they're all the same. We have to look very specifically case by case at what a tradition is talking about. But if we erase all this granular, very detailed nuance, which might be pure relative truth, it might be post-integral, but we actually mistakenly put it into pre-integral, pre-modern bucket, as if kind of, this kind of colonial move typically, as if all this indigenous wisdom is all this superstitious, pre-scientific, backwards, pseudo science. If we do that, there is pseudoscience and there's post-science science. There's pre-science and there's post-science. And so Tibetan Buddhism says there's a lot of post-science, a lot of integral 2.0, or a lot of more integrative steps to do after we're integrating emptiness into our lived experience. There's a lot of pure relative truth to keep integrating as well. So that's a big statement, and thus this is a big book. And the book itself has so many quotes from different masters and the Buddha and Guru Rinpoche, because this is not my view. This is standard lineage Tibetan Buddhist stuff. And so there's a lot of examples, lived examples of how Buddhism is an integral system, of how it's a function of an integral worldview, of how Tibetan Buddhism was an integral culture. That's also a very fascinating point. Oftentimes there's the sense that we have no clue what an integral culture might look like because integral's at the frothy edge of emergence, and there's never been anything further integrated than what we've experienced before. But I would say, as one example amongst hopefully very many, Tibetan Buddhism is a living example of post-turquoise, of a culture that's post-turquoise. And so Cindy Wigglesworth talks about this in terms of spiral dynamics, as if we go through the spiral of purple, magenta, into red, into blue, into orange, into green, into teal yellow, into turquoise, or basically if we go from pre-modern into modern, into postmodern, into post-postmodern, as we get more whole, right? That eventually that'll go into, basically, it'll keep integrating further, and we'll get into the healthy post-integral version of purple and red and orange and blue and green and all of them. And so I'm arguing that's what Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana is already a living example of. And so one way to say this, and then we'll get into kind of back and forth conversation with Namali and I, because I'm throwing some really big things out here, and then we'll see where people are curious to kind of dive deeper into. When Tibetan Buddhism, like Buddhism in general, starts with the idea of precious human birth. So we really take a lot of time into like really looking into with gratitude and detail how like this opportunity to be in a human body with these very specific circumstances, how that's such a special thing that we should be really joyful and grateful about and use really well with a lot of quality, because it's so unique and fragile, this lived experience of humanness, of the abilities we come with in this human vehicle. And I think what that means is actually turquoise. That once we get a healthy, just using spiral dynamics terms again, a healthy purple, healthy red, healthy blue, healthy orange, healthy green, healthy integral, that's called healthy relative sense of self in Tibetan Buddhism. It's assuming we're getting that. All these kind of components are turning on and they're starting to sync up and kind of connect in this more intricative whole sense of me. And with that foundation, then we start going into, well, what's the next layering of purple? Not digging back into purple and making it healthy. That was part of just getting a healthy sense of me. Now we're exploring what it's like with that very healthy, robust, integrated turquoise sense of me. What's it like to do purple then? What's it like to do orange then? Pre-modern, modern, postmodern then? And I think that my argument is, that's what I think Vajrayana is doing. And that's what all these tantras are doing. So you could say Zen plus tantras equals Dzogchen. So these tantras of pure body and pure speech and pure mind all together is an integral whole. These tantras, which are just way out of the box for most people. It's talking about other world systems and all these world systems in us and all these different extra cognitive ways of communicating with each other. And all these like kind of embodied, enmeshed, extended, post-propositional ways of being and becoming and knowing. These are all possible for human beings as just a natural function of being human. Not being superhuman, just being more naturally human, more integrated as a human, or as a mind, it doesn't have to be a human body either. But so, I'm saying a lot of things here, and I'm also just saying it, I didn't do a slideshow thing because I wanted to be more conversational. I also don't really have much experience with slideshows, so I wanted to kind of stick more to the kind of principles and kind of like specific ideas for this session because it's so short. But is that good, Namali, just for a basic overview to touch into certain threads and kind of see what we're curious about here?
Yes, I think that we can definitely get into more conversation and see what emerges. And I definitely want to hear from as many of us gathered here as much as is possible also. So thank you, Dragpa. I'm always just touched by, you speak of such like really serious topics, but there's a lot of heart in what you're saying, and I always just really appreciate that. So yeah, this book is, and I'll admit I haven't read all of it. I remember receiving the PDF of it from you many years, I think a couple years ago, and you've probably added things, removed things, and I read chunks of it from the PDF, and I've read chunks of it from the actual book here as well. And first of all, I think here you are, who's really bringing something to the table that perhaps hasn't been done before, bringing a real view of how integral and Tibetan Buddhism have all these connecting points, have all these things that they can teach each other, learn from each other. And so given all of that, you also received a wonderful celebration from Ken Wilber himself, and also some points that he didn't agree with on this big labor of love that you had created. And first of all, I mean, I don't know how you felt, but when you shared it with me, I think again, probably more than a year ago, maybe, and I felt a little bit of an ouch. Oh gosh, you know.
Ooh, it burned.
Yes, I know. And I just like big hug, right?
Thank you.
So, and I also just thought, wow, like how courageous for you to also lead, to still have kept his critique in some ways. You could have easily decided not to to just omit it from the publication, but you
Yeah.
chose to include it. And I think just to begin with, I think that's amazing that you did that. And to my best understanding, the sort of the integral lineage, I guess, or if there is any such thing, there isn't really an integral lineage, certainly not yet. But Wilbur is one of the teachers, like one of the Rinpoches, so to say, of integral. And I guess his main critique was that you claim that integral Tibetan Buddhism is it's sort of always already integral. And then also Wilbur is pointing out to the ways in which you're also making somewhat of a contradictory statement that says make Tibetan Buddhism integral. It's like, so that's what he was sort of
Yeah.
poking you a little bit with that. How is it that Dragpa is making this contradictory statement? In one way, you're saying Tibetan Buddhism is already integral.
Yeah.
And then you also go on to say how Tibetan Buddhism should become more integral.
Yeah. Great.
So,
Awesome.
yeah. So do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Please. Yeah, that's such a lovely, really relevant, very important topic. Thanks, Namali. So integral worldview as an approach, as a view, there is that worldview, that just consciousness, that world where you're kind of in a teal or a turquoise mode of kind of being with experience and of interpreting. So that's one. Just first locating, is it more or less an integral view that's happening right now? So that's one point. The second point is, in that mode of experience, can it be integrated further with more details or more theories, more models, more ways of cutting, parsing, slicing, and interpreting that experience? Yes, infinitely. There are infinite ways to slice the relative pie. We can use Freudian analysis. We can use Fritz Perls. We can use Hinduism. We can use cognitive behavioralism. But to be in an integral worldview doesn't mean you have to know all those theories. Mm-hmm. Because that means no one could ever be in an integral worldview. Because there's always further to integrate. There's always more ways to arrange the furniture in that world space. So in general, you can be in an integral worldview or have a view that's integrally informed and not know a whole lot about reality. You could have never read a book. You could not know anything that's happened on Jupiter. You could not know what's going on inside your body. I mean, you could not know like very significant, the linguistic turn in postmodernism or, the classical Newtonian physics, and you could still be coming from an integral approach. It's just you have further to integrate, and there's a lot of different theoretical models and also juicy insights to include more. And so I just don't see that as like a fundamental contradiction, because there's always more ways. It's like Daniel Schmachtenberger has said that, good science is always a working model trying to make itself less prone to mistakes, just to make itself a better working model. But to model the world is different than the world, than reality. Modeling or representing reality is always different than reality. So to be in a lived experience of integral as your living embodied view is one thing. And then all the theoretical ways you fill out that view to highlight certain features of it, to zoom in on specific cosmic addresses in that world space, then that's a question of your skill in the world space of integral. And so I really don't see any big contradiction there. Like even in bodhisattvas, like if you look at it in terms of the bhumis or the levels in bodhisattvas of those stages for enlightenment in Mahayana Buddhism. So the first level is you constantly have an uninterrupted recognition of the emptiness or the interdependence of all phenomena, outer and inner phenomena. You're constantly with emptiness awareness. Even when you sleep, even when you're awake, when you're dying, you always recognize the empty nature of your mind and its experience. And there's still 10 levels of further refinement, where you have to include more detail, more relational truth that's still obscured, that's still being covered up by emotional or cognitive covers, layers, occlusions, ways of not being fully on, having your nature not be fully full. Like you're with all relative experience without omission. And so I really don't see that. What do you think, Namali? So I think, I mean, so you could be in it, you can say Buddhism comes from an integral approach because it recognizes the limitations of pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and post-postmodern. It includes their valuable contributions, generally speaking, of pre-modern, modern, postmodern, post-postmodern. And as a general approach, that's what it assumes as a minimum, as its lowest common denominator. And still, you can learn more about science and learn more about evolutionary biological theory and learn more about AI and all these emergent fields that we're actively creating and like playing with and making mistakes around and still be integral. You're just integrating more of relative truth.
Okay. And then, so how would you, two questions. So from with that explanation, then would you also say that all other traditions are integral as well in a certain way? Because for whatever, even though they may not necessarily get into pre-modern, modern, in that way, but there are integral concepts that are in every tradition somehow, because integral comes out of, in many ways, these other traditions. It's, integral stands on the shoulders of a lot of other giants.
Yeah, so that's the beauty of it. And that prevents integral fundamentalism. That insight, exactly. Because anytime we integrate anything further, a line, a level, a shadow, an approach, a quadrant, or to say that inversely, anytime we lessen our absolutism, this is just the way it is. Anytime we loosen that up and have a more relational experience or view of it is an integral move, is a lived experience of integrating further. So anything that does that in the entire infinite all-qual stack of perspectives, any move that integrates further is an integral move. But that's different than being in an integral mode. Like it's to make, for example, to be in a modern perspective of science and to do it less as scientism, like a religion, like science is the only way to understand reality, and more like science is a really robust predictive modeling system for using evidence and corroborating that evidence after diligent testing with controlled experiments, like to get a better theory. That's a healthier move of modernity, a healthier modern approach, as opposed to the scientism, unhealthy modern approach. And that's an integral move. But that's still fundamentally different than how a lot of postmodern insights are generated. And a lot of postmodern or integral insights are different. So I think it's just to say generally, the integral or postmodern worldview, that approach, is definitely different than doing an integral move at any other place in any perspective. So it wouldn't be right to say like, well, any perspective is coming from that integral worldview, because it's not. But anytime a perspective integrates goodness, truth, and beauty, or like however you would say it, anytime it integrates more fullness and more open, flexible interdependence, that's an integrative move that's very valuable. Specifically for that perspective, it'll allow its own natural intelligence to include more and to like function more kind of elegantly or more completely.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Good. I have so many questions to ask, so I'm not going to linger on any one for too long. There another sort of a bit of a critique that Wilbur offered was that in some ways, you know, you might bring up a topic like cleanup, for example. So most of us who are in integral studies, we know about how Wilbur has talked about grow up, wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up. So he, you know, uses an example of how cleaning up, the example that you offer of sort of having a healthy relative self, which is incredibly obviously a common invitation in all Buddhist traditions. And I think he seems to say that alone is sort of too flimsy in some ways. It sort of doesn't honor all the Western psychological developmental work that people like Fritz Perls or Carl Jung or any of the other people have done to bring to that. With that, I also remember a long time ago, a very long time ago, we were at an event in Denver with Ken Wilber, and Brother Wayne was the guest of that event. And some of you might know who Brother Wayne Teasdale is. He died many years ago also. I think he lived in Chicago and wrote a book called The Monk in the World. Brother Wayne was, you know, talking about his Catholic tradition, growing up in it, and one of the women in the audience said, I will forever sort of hate my Catholic tradition because of what it did to her in forcing her to go to confession. That the practice of confession within the Catholic tradition for her was incredibly damaging, according to her, and how she shared this moment with a lot of vulnerability. And I still remember Ken being incredibly kind to her and just very like received her beautifully. And he also very gently and very skillfully taught that in an odd kind of way, confession, when you reveal something that perhaps you're made to believe is a sin, or that you did something wrong and now you have to talk about it, you're forced to talk about it, that in an odd kind of way, that's an act of cleaning up, that's an act of doing your shadow work. Because whatever is you're holding that maybe you feel rightly or wrongly is something you did that is of sin. But when you reveal it, when you expose it with the trusted other, now in her case, she didn't trust anybody. And I think for her, it was a very difficult moment. But from an integral perspective, if something is done right, then it is a beautiful, beautiful moment of a certain kind of an integral practice. And she really had to think about that, and she received it really beautifully. And it was like, yeah, it's like something that I was holding as deeply ugly and painful and shameful inside of me. I can now see how talking about it with somebody at the basic level, it's like a therapy in some ways, is an opportunity to do shadow work. In Theravadan Buddhism, which is where I grew up, I remember in the monastic tradition, once a month, there is in the Thai forest tradition, once a month monks get together and they're supposed to reveal to the whole group the ways in which they broke the Vinaya, the Vinaya. Yeah. They have the 227 rules or the precepts that monks are supposed to follow in the Theravadan tradition. And if they exploited any of them, abused any of them, broke any of those precepts, they're supposed to sort of say that all out in the open. So when Ken offered you a little bit of critiquing around whether there's any actual cleanup in the Tibetan tradition.
Mhm.
I'm curious, what's an actual example of how you do shadow work that is taught in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition?
Yeah, sweet. Thanks, Amali. You said a lot. It's beautiful. One, I think, yeah, to have a healthy relative sense of self is vitally important. This is in Buddhism in general, and in Tibetan Buddhism is no way against this. It's foundational bedrock to the approach. And then any ways that help facilitate that for a being, that's great. And there's been new explorations, new meaning 200 years, 100 years, 50 years. There's a wave of trauma work happening now that's becoming more mainstream and more kind of like actively spotlighted. And it's beautiful, it's wonderful. And Buddhism in no ways against any of that. It's like vitally important to have a really grounded, healthy, embodied experience as much as possible that's also seeing the ways that we've been hurt, harmed, stuck, repressed. And there's really specific experts and thorough theories that like we should use to do that work. And we like people should use according to what they're interested in and what's suitable for their lived experience, right?
Mhm.
So Buddhism's not against any of that. But Tibetan Buddhism in particular, it has its own confession every 2 weeks to do like this practice. Like we have all these commitments that we're trying to like maintain the integrity of a living ecology of the view of our own lived experience of pure body, pure speech, pure mind. And we're like coming together as a group or individually or in the presence of enlightened beings. And we're specifically saying that I've made these mistakes. And they say in Buddhism, the one thing that's essentially good about a negative action is to identify it and to recognize that it was actually not helpful. It was harmful. It was a way that I shut down my own intelligence, my goodness, my beauty, my love, my wisdom. And so that's the quality is that it can be recognized and actually undone or opened up. Like, and so, but that's based on a view. The view is we're not fundamentally broken. In Tibetan Buddhism, we're fundamentally, everyone is fundamentally good. It's like innately pure. It's not, it doesn't have a sense that we're fundamentally sinful or wrong or broken. It like Buddhism doesn't hold that view. And so with the view that like fundamentally our nature, our heart and our mind is naturally brilliant. It's naturally boundless love, compassion, and wisdom. Then a mistake in that context is a way we're holding our love and compassion and wisdom. We're basically like limiting it or collapsing it. And so the confession would be to have that love, that natural goodness be more brightly and naturally free-flowing. So we're not trying to say I have this innate core that's like totally horrible and so like, you know, I'm sorry. Instead, it's saying my innate core, my like totally open freedom nature is 100% good and limitless. And like I keep not seeing that and not being in touch with that. So there's so many ways, like any Vajrayana practice, the first step is to recognize that essential goodness. And you could see that as a confession practice. Like, I'm not going to believe in the mistaken way of collapsing and believing I'm a horrible human being that's just like a combination of horrible actions. Instead, that's called Vajra of pride. We see immediately on the dot in lived real experience my own innate essential goodness right now. And it's boundless. And it's empty of anything that's like actually fundamentally stuck. It's totally free of that. And that's the beginning moment of any Vajrayana practice. And from that awareness, it expands into boundless infinite compassion that then crystallize and take shape and form and activity into these enlightened forms as a deity with kind of pure sound or mantra doing enlightened activities. This is all the context of a Tibetan Buddhist practice session, or it's called sadhana. So every time we do that is a confession. We're actually confessing, I'm not fundamentally wrong. I might temporarily not see that, but we look closely right at our mind, have our mind look at itself, our heart understand itself intimately right now, and it releases that fixation on that negativity. And so that's one way That's called a transformative technique in Tibetan Buddhism. But there's 4 main ways. One is called, the more foundational Theravada, is getting space. If we're with an object of attention that immediately locks us up, we get space from the object because it's too overpowering for us. There's no room. We can't help it. So we get space from the object. The second is purification. They sometimes call it like antidote. Oh, we're around an object that immediately makes us impatient and we get agitated. Instead, that's not my nature to be agitated. It's actually to be patient, relaxed, accommodating, and clear, seeing interdependence. And so I'm going to intentionally cultivate patience as an antidote to that mistaken fixation, to that temporary withholding of my nature. That's called antidote. And so we're purifying that temporary mistake by balancing it. The third is transformation. We see our innate goodness and we instantly arise as that innate goodness in the form of some pure body, pure speech, pure mind. So as a deity with mantra in a pure universe doing enlightened activity. And the fourth is called self-liberation, sometimes called self-crumbling. We're naturally like in a space of free flow natural goodness, or turquoise, or kind of post-turquoise, where like any type of experience, any movement of mind, any like way that our energy circulates, it's already in a healthy kind of like, it's already in touch with its own innate goodness. And so any way that it coils itself naturally undoes itself as the movement happens. They say like clouds moving in the sky. So without additional effort, if our view is so confidently, courageously, naturally aligned or attuned to its own open, free flow nature, then any kind of ways that we keep locking up will just spontaneously keep undoing themselves. So if we have a habit energy to collapse, as we get more stable in that experience or that view, it'll naturally kind of unfold itself. That's called self-liberation. And so those 4 approaches, getting space, purifying, transforming, self-liberating, those are actually the 4 general kind of approaches of these 4 vehicles in Tibetan Buddhism: foundational Buddhism, Zen or Bodhisattvayana, outer tantras, inner tantras. Or you can sometimes say it's more foundational Buddhism, Sutra Mahayana, Tantra or Vajrayana, and Dzogchen. So those are all ways to confess an impurity, or like kind of a way that we're restricting our natural healthy goodness. But is that a therapy? Not exactly. I mean, this great master Dzogchen Khensa Rinpoche says, anytime we take a therapeutic approach, as if something's broken and we need to remedy it or fix it, heal it, support it, nourish it, that's a sutra approach. So Buddha taught so many sutras, right? There's a stain there that needs to be removed. There's a temporary negativity that we need to do some effortful activity to open that negativity or remove it. And the Tantra approach is, we don't fundamentally believe there's a stain there. There's only goodness and beauty and brilliance everywhere we look. And to re-recognize that view is the Tantra approach. So it doesn't believe anything's fundamentally broken. It believes everything's fundamentally pure. And the same person, the Buddha Shakyamuni, taught both of these approaches, the therapeutic approach and also the recognize your innate goodness right now approach. And depending on what worldview we're in right now, we can use whichever one's helpful for whatever the worldview we're currently in.
Beautiful. Thanks, Dragpa. So just a couple other questions and then we'll open it up. Let's talk a little bit about lineage, because this is one of the big things of your book, The Integral View of Tibetan Buddhism, Preserving Lineage Wisdom in the 21st Century. That's the title of your book, Preserving Lineage. So you know that I'm always a polarity person. So preserving lineage to me almost immediately also brings up the question of preserving and also innovation. So we preserve what has come before us, we protect it, we guard it. And then there is also some way in which we know that evolution can't really happen if we also don't innovate and expand and make new. And something is always already unknown and novel about any kind of an emergent reality.
Yep.
So First of all, what is the difference between lineage and tradition for you?
Such a juicy question. Great. So I'll say it. Living lineage is non-dogmatic. It's not fundamentalist. So as a general response, I'm going to go with that. It's non-fundamentalist, meaning whatever the approach is, it has to dissolve itself as it performs itself. That's how it maintains non-fundamentalist. So every technique in Buddhism, every view in Buddhism naturally extends beyond its temporary limitations. It dissolves itself into further naturalness. That's how you know it's alive. It's living. It's not just holding a belief and then you just pound the belief against your lived experience. It's holding a view, and as that view is further informed with interdependence or lived experience, either study, conceptual, or non-conceptual, meditative or practical, it actually, the view is trying to release its holding, its grasping, its limitations. And that's why it's fundamentally non-dogmatic or not fundamentalist when it's alive. But that's the challenge of this book to Buddhists. You can be a fundamentalist pre-modern Buddhist. You can be an extreme modern Buddhist. You can be an extreme postmodern Buddhist. You can be an extreme integral Buddhist. So you can believe that all you need to do is just worship the Buddha as he's a god. Like that's extreme pre-modern Buddhist approach. The Buddha fundamentally said you can't approach like that. You could believe that Buddhism is only a science. That's extreme modern approach to Buddhism. You could believe that Buddhism's only a story, or it's only my personal felt lived experience. That's an extreme postmodern approach to Buddhism. Integral, you could believe that like an unhealthy integral, it's just a convenient mapping system. And there's basically, it's like holding kind of the richness that's like basically boundless richness, holding that in a kind of container so that the UN will take you seriously. That's kind of can be extreme or a little reifying integral approach. So anyway, so lineage versus tradition. Tradition, it depends, because it depends on what you mean by tradition. But lineage, like in this, when I define lineage in this book, 405, it's basically like 10 pages of defining lineage, and it's just very poetic. And it's just examples of what lineage means to me. I'll read a few, is that okay? Just really quick, not all of it. Vajrayana lineage is the support needed to go deeper. It's the polished mirror to see clearly. It's the resolute anchor to hold fast. Lineage is the bright through line to orient around. It's the guiding light to move towards. Lineage is one's own Buddha nature reaching out to itself, within others and oneself, connecting the two inseparably. The power of lineage guidance enables paced forward progression as obstacles arise. It boosts our courage in the face of challenge, loss of clarity, and demons of doubt. Lineage pulls us into the orbit flow ignited by countless others before us who overcame self-obsession. Lineage enables us to surrender completely to interdependence. It is the powerful avenue of dissolving boundaries that neither protect nor defend, but hold us back from expanding our vision. There's just these are all definitions of lineage here in my experience. But what I've seen in a little bit of like the relevance of lineage, especially in our AI information overload kind of age we're in, is as all these systems come crashing together and cross-pollinating and creating all these hybrid meshwork mashup versions of themselves, many of which are just very chaotic, or heapism, as Wilber calls it. They're not coherent. They're just heaps of stuff together, right? When the power of all these perspectives come together, if we don't have supportive structures that are larger than those systems combining, if we don't have a next level layer to actually hold those colliding heaps or those colliding systems together, I think, in my experience, I don't think we'll be able to make it through that. I think the obstacles, the challenges, the power will be too great. I think in Buddhism, this is actually what like relying on lineage blessing is so key. But it requires like this suspension of disbelief. It requires, and here Wilber calls it in terms of his how he defines modernism. A beauty of the world-centric view is it includes hypothetical deductive reasoning. What if? To be able to suspend disbelief and say, and do counterfactuals. Well, what if the world was like so and so and so? And that's a standard rational level ability that can come online. And so what Tibetan Buddhism's arguing is actually like, once we get to integral, then we need to reactivate that hypothetical deductive reasoning, that what if capacity, that imaginary next layer out of the box kind of including emergent, more liminal kind of way of unfolding with what if this wasn't the first time the universe happened? What if there are world systems that have already been through similar problems? What if human knowledge is just one way of knowing things and there's synthetic ways or non-human ways? What if fill in the out-of-the-box amazing emergent things? What if AI's IQ is going to be twice the amount of the smartest human's IQ within a year? What if that happens, and what do we do? Like having that imaginary capacity to think out of the box based on rational grounded evidence, based on really healthy felt lived experience and story making, based on really corroborated integral maps. That what if capacity into the imaginal is about to get super relevant. And this is like the bread and butter of Tibetan Buddhism. This what if imaginary capacity. That's not just what if fill in your woo-woo thing. It's not like a conspiracy theory thing where you take 95% of actual science and then you fill in 5% of crazy things about lizards that are like whatever. You fill in your kind of thing. It's not like that. It's saying, do everything with integrity all the way up the stack, and then let the stack grow further beyond its current like ways of holding itself, but do it intelligently, use these Vervaekian terms, procedural, perspectival, participatory, and propositional knowing, like really have a full on like integrated kind of openness to what might come next. Because anytime we think we're the leading edge of emergence, of evolution, usually that's called fundamentalism.
Yep. So you speak about preservation in this book, and yet I think a lot of us who are familiar with Buddhism, the sort of the other side of that same coin would also say there's nothing to preserve.
Yeah.
Right? So here's the kind of the ongoing life of contradiction and paradoxes and polarities within Buddhism. So and by the way, for anyone who isn't that familiar with Integral, this book is also really great just to get to know Integral, because Dragpa really offers the Integral basics in such a lovely, cohesive way, without ever having to read a Ken Wilber book. You speak about the second tenet. You present the second tenet, and some of us will know that in the 20 tenets that Wilber offers, the second tenet has 4 different patterns. One is the self-preservation. Then there is self-adaptation, that evolution does both of these things. And also that there is self-transcendence and also self-dissolution.
Yeah.
So if I were to apply this to your tradition or any lineage, actually, when you speak of preservation, what is the relationship that you see to dissolution?
Yeah, awesome. So this is one of the things I super love about Tibetan Buddhism, because it has such a good example for this. And it's called the 9 yana system, or the 9 levels or vehicles, the 9 worldviews or ecologies, the 9 yanas of study and practice. So the basic idea is level 1 is like core foundational Buddhism. And in addition, it opens into level 2, and level 3. Level 3 is Bodhisattva Yana, Zen. And in addition to that, it incorporates Tantras, level 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And in addition to that, it incorporates Dzogchen, level 9. And so that experience of like, how do you preserve level 3 and include more to go into level 4? How does level 4 incorporate the valuable aspects of level 3? So how do the Tantras incorporate the Bodhisattva Yana? How does Dzogchen incorporate Vajrayana? How does all of it incorporate the foundational bedrock teachings of the Buddha, like the Four Noble Truths? In the 9 yana systems, all the lineage masters are adamant. Like any higher level of yana or approach, the study and practice of Buddhism has to include the sub-yanas. And so this is where it's a very tricky topic. Tricky meaning for centuries, Buddhists have debated this with themselves. It's called, the tension is called provisional and definitive truth. Provisional truth is how a deluded being sees something, and then because they're like, say it's like a 4-year-old. If there's an adult talking to a 4-year-old, the adult has to basically water down their kind of full understanding to match the 4-year-old's what they're ready for. And then the 4-year-old grows, becomes a 10-year-old. And the adult doesn't have to water it down as much because the 10-year-old now has like a more full, we're saying in a healthy kind of very generally, has a more full view of experience at a 10-year-old, both all quadrants, their brains, their sociological embodiment, their culture, all the things. So in terms of an integral perspective. But the provisional thing is, this great master calls it a Cinderella story. How the Buddha has to water down the truth in order for beings to actually receive it and be able to like use it, like so it's actually workable. And so that's provisional. Anytime an enlightened being has to use something that an unenlightened being needs to understand it, that's called provisional. And definitive is, how do enlightened beings talk to each other when they're just hanging out? They don't have to water down anything. It's just fact of the matter, this is how reality functions. And so because this is they call it, this is why it's all, this is so fascinating with like John Vervaeke's work with agent arena dynamics, Greg Enriquez, metamodernism to some degree that I know of it. It's all these internested ecologies. And that's what a 9 yana system is. It's each level is an ecology of study and practice, of how you activate and turn on like full quadrant realization at that level, of what lines are really like being called to like turn on or cue in or attune to one another, what threads of a Four Noble Truth, the Eightfold Noble Path, how do you really attune the eight folds, like the 8 approaches, into a single channel or a single thread? Like this happens at every different level of a yana system in Buddhism. But then as the yana system kind of starts to optimize itself, it's self-optimizing or autopoetic. As it optimizes itself in terms of complexity theories, it naturally extends beyond its own limitations. It actually starts pointing out its own provisional temporary holding patterns that no longer serve it as a thriving yana or level or approach. And it'll naturally unfold into the next yana, into the next higher, more integrated level. So that's actually how the internested ecologies of the yana systems work. That how the Buddha taught that they work, how these great contemporary lineage masters, they all teach it like this. And so the way to do that, it's hard because to understand all this stuff takes decades of practice and decades of study if we're really good, you know, and that's just to like have a basic thing. But that's where Vajrayana has this path called the swift path of skillful means, is you rely on an expert, a teacher, who's really good at all these 9 yana systems, who really cares about you with bodhicitta, living compassion for you and all beings, whatever it takes to have your own Buddha nature, your own natural goodness fully shine on. They'll sync up with that according to how much they can see of it. And then they'll give you the exact pith instruction, the exact kind of medicine, or the exact kind of like elegant single point, or like very distilled few points that integrate all this complex theory that would have taken decades to learn or decades to practice, they integrate it into a few bite-sized pithy points that then hit the basic points of each of the yana systems. So each of the yanas naturally, kind of as a whole system, syncs up with the larger yanas. So this is actually the power of pith instructions in Vajrayana. I mean, I've been calling it in a little bit meta-heuristics. It's like, and I think more and more there's a lot of talk around first principles.
Can I pause you there for a little
Yeah.
bit, Dragpa, just in terms of time?
Cool.
What is your own relationship to, because in some ways you and I are coming at preserving something that we both love. In your case, preserving and allowing for the emergence and the evolution of Tibetan Buddhism. And in my case, it's probably integral.
Yeah.
Integral is, I wouldn't call it a lineage. And I think perhaps we both have a fear that what we love might just disappear and vanish into thin air. In fact, that was the title of the presentation that I did at the Integral European Conference. Is integral going to vanish into thin air?
Yeah.
And at the same time, having to sort of deal with the reality of the kind of the brutal truth also of, well, what I'm trying to preserve is also automatically, naturally dissolving.
Yeah.
You know, so I suppose that's also just an uncomfortable, inconvenient truth. So I guess I'm just going to ask you, and after this, maybe you can just say briefly, and then I want to open it up to everyone else. What is your lived experience of being in a lineage? Your not a definition of lineage, but your lived felt sense of being in your lineage, and also your felt sense of, while you try to preserve that, to also allow it to dissolve because you can't help it.
Yeah, so in my experience, growth is very demanding. This is why Buddhism is not, it doesn't have a conversion impulse. It's so highly participatory to be a Buddhist, because every moment I have to keep turning on my experience, like as a lived experience, this view now. And as I've lived here, almost every year without fail, I've had these two teachers, Venerable Kenshin Palden Sherpa Rinpoche, Venerable Khenpo Sewan Donyo Rinpoche. And I've been living here at their kind of retreat center in New York for about 20 years. And really without fail, for many, many years, that they would kind of like, can I tell a quick story? A quick story. So here, I won't tell the story because it's too long. So what living lineage is like is if you have you're with someone and you trust them because they've proven themselves trustworthy. And then they have the power, because of that trust, like an actual healthy relationship, to not just love you for all the wonderful things to celebrate, but to actually give you feedback on the ways you're kind of tripping over yourself and all these blind spots that I have. And that's part of like living in a lineage container, is like being with a community and a teacher with a specific guide in a specific ecology, and not just popping between ecologies, but actually staying put and growing roots somewhere. That so many times the teachers will really point out in me, oh, Dragpa, you're doing this, you know? This is really kind of like holding you back. And it's very excruciating to kind of go through that actually. It's actually really small, subtle things. Once I was so puffed up, I had become newly a monk, had new monk clothes. I was coming up to the temple. I lit some fire thing, and I was rushing over a little bit late to Rinpoche's house. And they were coming for a big ceremony for like honoring the Buddha first turning the wheel of Dharma, the teaching. And I rushed to the house, and I was a little late, and they're coming, both Rinpoches out the back. And I get to the first older Rinpoche, Kenshin Rinpoche, and I'm like coming towards him, and he looks straight by me. as if I'm not there at all. And then I was like, oh, that's odd. And then I pass him and I get to the other teacher, Khenpo Rinpoche, and I came to Rinpoche and he looked at me, he stopped and he looked at me, looked at my head, did a full body scan, looked up, and he said, congratulations. And right then that moment, my ego was so crushed. I was so puffed up and proud. I'm a monk. Look at my clothes. I'm going to walk with the teachers and come in the thing and I'll hold the thing. And it was just, that's what crazy wisdom is in Tibetan Buddhism. When it's not just crazy, it's actually wisdom. My whole suit of armor, this complex system of like self-defending and self-obsessing, and these great masters, they can hit the exact vulnerable point that actually helps the system correct itself to be more fully integral, more enhanced, more natural. But it doesn't take some big bat or a hammer. It's just a tiny little thing because they see so clearly. But that's actually really painstaking. To be in a trusting relationship where you can really take feedback like that and have your shadow pointed out, that's why, I mean, it's really a careful thing to learn to trust someone that much before you're willing to like receive that kind of feedback. It's like a very long process that can't just be microwaved in some speedy weekend course. So that's like living lineage. And over time, then I become more available to more kind of feedback of how I'm basically like holding myself back, my own nature holding itself back. And what is like the preserving element is that nature is what's being preserved. Actually, the nature is not like wearing this or having a name like Dragpa or living in a certain place. Those are all just temporary relative features and they'll change. When I'm dead, those are all dissolved. Then nothing. I won't be able to take any of that. It'll just be like how open my mind is now and what habit layers I've kind of like covered it up with. Good habits and bad habits. That's the only thing that'll actually be preserved in like more long kind of geological time in Buddhism. So that's why they say, look at your mind, look at your heart, work with that, because that's actually what continues. All the other supports, they're only supportive to help that awakening happen. And we need to use them for that. Like they're vitally important to have these supportive conditions, but they're only temporarily helpful. 100 years from now, as the mind continues, what was helpful for me now might not really be helpful at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dragpa. Thank you so much for engaging me in a little bit of discussion. So let's open up. I'd love to just and I know that technically this is actually the 90-minute time, but Dragpa, can you give us a little bit more time? Okay, great. Let's go to iPhone CC.
Hi, sorry, I had to switch. I spilled a cup of tea on my laptop in the middle of it. So I had to run around and get a phone and download Zoom, and I hadn't signed iPhone CC. My name's Kieran. So hi. Thank you so much, Dragpa. I can't see Dragpa. I'm seeing the host.
I'm here.
Yeah, so you're not coming up now. How's that? So,
but I'm good with you, Kieran. I can hear you.
Oh, I've got you now. I've got you now. Yeah, great. Hey, dude. Totally loved your chat, and only heard about your book on the calendar today. So quite excited to see that someone has written a book like that. I'm a big fan of Wilbur's for 20 years and a big fan of Vajrayana for 20 years with Karma Kagyu. And so it's been a real wrestle for me over the 20 years working with but two very complex systems and trying to figure out how they basically interrelate and support each other in a sane way. So really, I really look forward to checking out your book. And I'd love to chat with you independently as well if you're up for those kind of conversations, because it's such an interesting area to try and figure out what integral Vajrayana, if such a thing could exist, might look like. But that aside, just on some of the points of what you brought up, when you said like the healthy relative sense of self coming into the Vajrayana, do not think that in a sense the Vajrayana actually, through the different kinds of deities that you might try and relate with in the Bodhisattva yoga or renunciation yoga, that it's actually coming back and it's actually healing all these lower structures in a sense. And so it has got that cleaning up component to it in terms of the structures that, say, Bodhisattva yoga might deal with, as opposed to so some of the higher level Tantra practices might deal with. Even lower structures, some of the energy of the lower structures, but brought up to a higher mind. There's the first part of the question. The next thing was, is Tibetan culture turquoise? I mean, that's a bit of a leap. I can certainly see that the texts and stuff are very turquoise and third tier. And then if you get some of these Rinpoches, they're most definitely got a turquoise aspect, or third tier, really stable third tier or turquoise and lower structure health going on. But the culture they enact is not integral. And the way they relate with, 21st century dialogue about global state of the world is most definitely not integral. So just your thoughts on that. And the final point is, Wilber's discussion of the third tier structure stages, and how I think sometimes when I think of his third tier structure stages, he's really talking about the process of the Vajrayana at that point, when it's really going more inner Tantra energy. Does that make sense? And so your thoughts on all of that. So that's a bit of a long, but
good, awesome.
Yeah,
great, rich questions. Thanks so much. So the first point, we're like all different configurations of wounds. Wounds this life, in Buddhist context, wounds for many lives. Ways that our experiences caused our Buddha nature to basically kind of not see itself. So because we're all so many extraordinarily complex webs of wounds covering this natural goodness, there's a lot of different ways to heal those wounds. And so if doing deity practice is one way that's working for someone, that's wonderful. If doing certain therapeutic modalities is other ways. I mean, Buddha, in integral psychology, Wilber's book is that certain kind of levels of development are correlated with certain levels of therapeutic modality. And it's really good to get really specific about the cosmic address, the quadrant level line state type of a certain wound or a trauma, a fixation, a kind of a collapsing. It's really good to really target that specifically so that we can use the appropriate modality that's specifically designed for that way of collapsing. And so that's my general way of avoiding a fundamentalist answer to your question. If deity, visualization practice, can do that, which I think it can, but that requires a certain view. And that view, has to have certain wounds, not kind of collapsing the view so that it can't turn on. So that's very person specific, right? So, but use whatever is helpful to have a healthy sense of self so you can actually courageously engage or loosen up to have a fuller sense of self that's more versatile, more fluid, and actually unbounded, or in the end, boundless. So that's the first point as a general answer. The second point, I don't think Tibetan culture is integral. I think Tibetan Buddhism is integral. Vajrayana is integral. The great master Longchenpa, in his Treasury of Philosophical Systems, he taught that the Buddha taught Vajrayana, and this is standard Vajrayana stuff. Buddha taught the Vajrayana as a complete intact system before he went to Tibet. He taught that in India. And if you really keep reading that same book, he taught Vajrayana Buddhism before this earth existed. Many, many world systems back, he's taught Vajrayana Buddhism, the indestructible vehicle, for countless time. So many Buddhas have taught this. This actually has nothing to do with Tibet, has nothing to do with this earth. But the thing is like, we're beings that have bodies and we live in place and time, and we're obsessed with things like place and time. And language is a medium, a vehicle that we need to use as minds to communicate with each other. And that means we're necessarily enculturated. We have culture, and that's general integral stuff. You know, it's a quadrant, like the lower left quadrant's always going to be a cultural intersubjective kind of positioning or like embodiment. Like that's just how it's been, and pick a world system before this one, it had culture too. But Tibetan culture specifically, no, I think the Vajrayana teaching of the Buddha is definitely integral. But to talk about even Tibetan culture as a whole, to get really specific about which part we're talking about, and is it actually aligned with Tibetan Buddhism as a liberative method that's integral? That's a really different question.
I mean, just even the culture within Western Tibetan Buddhist centers doesn't strike me as very integral.
Yeah, so, and that's a specific, you have to go really case by case. I mean, like this great master Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche said, it's 100% possible if you apply the teachings of Vajrayana according to the teachings, that in this life you can be enlightened. But it's 100% impossible if you're not Tibetan in this life. It's 100% impossible for you to become Tibetan in this life. We're not practicing to become Tibetan. Just like there's a Vietnamese Buddhism, a Thai Buddhism, a Burmese Buddhism, and that's changed over time in different epochs. There's different pockets of Chinese Buddhism, like throughout such a vast region, in Tibet too, which is also beautiful, like compared with like the meta crisis we're dealing with, these global scale problems. Like Tibet is an example that from the 8th century until the 19th or 20th century, it had these pockets of different ecologies that all went to a same source of the Buddha, but they were relatively interdependent from each other. Like they didn't communicate across, a lot of them didn't ever know about each other at a long distance. It was never hyper-centralized as a whole thing of the 8 practice lineages. So it's a really interesting example of how to have a very large space with millions of people maintaining integral practices of study and practice for centuries in ways that aren't overly centralized so they don't become dogmatic, but they're not overly decentralized so they just become their own independent things. As a case in point, Vajrayana is a really interesting example of doing that. But that's not about culture. That's about like, it's not culture dependent. It doesn't have to be any specific way culturally. And so to confuse the two and say Tibetan Buddhism is all about momos and long sleeves and certain colors, and it has to be this language system, and we have to do these dances, if that helps someone, then it's skillful. So that means it's aligned with Vajrayana. But if it's not helpful, it's not skillful, which means it's not aligned with Vajrayana, actually, with the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. So it depends on the context, whether it's going to be helpful or not Tibetan culture. But certainly we're not trying to have all Tibetans in the world, just like we're not having to have all Buddhists in the world. We want people to wake up and like have more of their head and their heart integrated in more full lovely ways. That's actually what the impulse of Tibetan Buddhism, and I think integral, the same. It's all called the middle way in Buddhism. Buddhism calls that the middle way. And so the third part of your question was about which thing? Like what word? A phrase. And I'll remember.
Oh yeah, I was talking about Wilber's description of the third tier structure stages,
cool.
Illumined Mind, Overmind, Supermind, and how Supermind seems to me to be like, really the description of a Buddha, essentially. It's got the cosmic aspect, the vast cosmic relative aspect, as well as the absolute aspect, unified.
Yeah, so there was recently like a podcast episode on the Emerald that I heard. It's on The Revolution Will Not Be Psychologized. And this is an interesting thing. It was also an interview that my wife kind of highlighted to me about Bayo Akumalafe. saying overly psychologizing or only putting too much attention in the upper left quadrant, the interior subjective experience of an individual. I think Wilber's mapping third tier really in many, many lovely ways in that specific quadrant. And so Aurobindo, like he's kind of along those lines too. I don't know Aurobindo's work very well, but that's one quadrant of 4. And I don't think Wilber in particular, amongst the many amazing contributions he offered, I don't think he was highlighting the intersubjective third tier too much, or the interobjective. Or the objective. Well, it's because modern empirical science can't really do much testing of that yet.
Or there just aren't people there.
Or there's not people there, but I mean, often it's called like speculative metaphysics, and so Wilber's like saying integral post-metaphysics, and that it just requires empirical research. And I think Wilber is much more concerned, and justifiably so, to locate the next move, which is teal and turquoise, like what is integral, what is postmodern, and he's pausing on any really robust inquiry into like, okay, what's post integral? What's it like in such and such world system over there, 8 million light years away? I think he's just doesn't want to highlight that at the front, because already in modern academy, like even integral is seen as woo-woo. Just because he was talking about, you know, spirituality, like it's just seen as woo-woo already, let alone talk about this aliens and all this like more fringe components. You have integral people, like Wilberian integral identified people, like Layman Pascal, Bruce Alderman, and crew, Sean Oisbjorn Hargens, like amazing.
The UFOs.
And all that stuff. And most people aren't ready to be in that space, let alone be in the integral space. So I think Wilber's just playing it a little closer to the chest. But I think it's also just not his forte, the intersubjective and interobjective components. And that's fine. We all have our talents and specialties. Some people are awesome at doing the dialogos in community with different kind of group dynamics and having that open up. So I think the quick answer to that is just highlighting the third tier development of the interior consciousness of an individual. That's one thread of what third tier would involve. But there's also what's the morality, or what's the intersubjective culture making? What are the actual sociological infrastructures that are going to come with that? And Tantra, Buddhist Tantra, is filled with that stuff. But if you think of all that Tantra as being just pre-modern myth, or just like mythic superstition.
Filled with, I'm conscious now, not taking up all this time, but I've never seen Buddhist Tantra filled with stuff about how the techno-economic system of a third tier world system would, and hyperdrive space cars and stuff, would exist.
Yeah, I mean, cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I really appreciate that. I mean, how is it going to be? I mean, so that's where it gets really out of the box, right?
Yeah.
So with extra cognitive thing, they call it the clairs, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairvision. All these, in Buddhism, they call it siddhis. So what's it like when we can actually communicate between planets, like telepathically, and have instant perfect knowledge transfer with like actual memory recall of like eons of information? Well, there's beings in Tibetan Buddhism that say they can do that, like, and they're lineage holders. So what would it be like for at that level of like commerce? Like what would be the things they would want to buy, like the ways they would design buildings? So all that's are really curious questions, but I think a lot of the subtle level energy, like subtle relative truth stuff, becomes much less about physical brick and mortar lodging and like physical, as it gets more digital is like the first level of like subtle level embodied commerce, like where there's not actual paper. Like what happens when that gets more and more subtle? And I think that Vajrayana has a whole host of like all kinds of out there things with light transference and instant, like kind of like downloading instantly entire lineage threads, like the Terma tradition, for example. We'll have
Oh,
just
yeah,
like entire fields of information, volumes of text will just get inputted into someone's mind stream and will open up and they'll be able to replicate it. And independently, some other person would get the same so-called download and they would replicate it and then they'd cross-match them later and they'd be identical word for word. So that's
Yeah.
an interesting phenomena sociologically or culturally, if you believe that's possible. Most people
Yeah, yeah.
just don't believe it's possible. So the
Yeah,
question's not really on the table yet for most people. It more looks like, how do we not blow up the world? And what's the technology that'll do that? And Buddhism already answered that. Bodhicitta. How does AI not blow up the world? Bodhicitta. Like the compassion, heart of enlightenment. Like how do humans not blow up the world? Bodhicitta. Like wisdom and compassion together.
Yeah, I mean,
If we don't do that, we're just going to keep fighting each other, which basically just means pre-integral.
I think that's such a need at the moment is on the planet is a need for the creative positive vision of the future for the planet. That, you know, that vision logic, what if everyone got on and everything was brilliant and everyone was happy? And those kind of planetary visions, felt visions,
Yeah.
that kind of bodhicitta visions, I think are so needed at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Yeah, I agree. And I'm totally, be in touch with me. You can find my info online if you want to further do stuff. We'll go to Karen. And of course, I don't believe that everyone simultaneously will get to turquoise as something, but any integral move we make in anywhere in the all-qual stack is tremendously beneficial for the world. It doesn't only have to be getting up to the turquoise. Any spot we're in any level line, state type, any integral move is going to be very valuable right now, as it always has been.
Yeah.
What's up, Karen? How you doing?
Thanks, dude.
Hi.
Thanks.
Wow. This is awesome. Thank you, Dragpa. Thank you, Nomali. Thank you, Kieran, all of us. Wow. Gosh, I am just practically hardly able to sit still in my chair. I'm just vibrating with all of this groovy stuff. I personally vote for learning how not to blow up the planet before we go too far in accessing those super paranormal powers in cities, and that synchronistically feeds into the one fairly short comment I was going to make, and then I have a short practical question for you, Dragpa, and for Nomali. And my comment had to do with what I said at the very beginning when Nomali invited us to say a quick our kind of first connection with you. The one thing on the several 4 or 5 or 6 webinars I've been on with you over the past couple of years, Dragpa, I have noticed that you and I resonate on a very similar topic, which is the need to do shadow work as you grew up. And that has been very richly covered in this presentation and the conversation, because as Ken Wilber pointed out, I think he's spot on. As we personally go up the stages of development, at each stage structure is an order of magnitude more powerful in our way to deal with the world. And the Darth Vader move is possible at every single one of those stages. So as these cities, these what now seem to us to be paranormal powers, as they start to appear in more of us, which is a natural part of growing up through the second and especially the third tier stages, we need to be in communion with each other. Communities need to be in communion with each other, because that Darth Vader turn with these new powers is always a temptation and always a possible, unskillful turn. So we are kind of healing back, but we also need to be aware of the need to keep growing, be careful moving forward. And I've noticed in you, it wasn't in the terms you put it today, but you're very aware of the need to do, in Ken Wilber's term, shadow work as each of these stages emerge. And so I found it ironic, and this is my halfway through my fairly quick comment, I found it ironic, although beautiful, that Ken Wilber's critique of your book as you presented it here was kind of about that. And so I'll just pass really quickly on to my question with just one further that to be critiqued by Ken Wilber, I mean, to have him look at something I've done and have him engage it at that level and do a response, wow, what a compliment. So I get that it stung at the time, but what an amazing compliment too. So
Yeah, it's been
that's
beautiful.
Uh-huh.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yeah, and there's in the book, there's probably 100 pages of actual discussion with Wilbur. So, and then there was just back and forth kind of like correspondence. And I mean, what a privilege. Like it's really, he's obviously, to highlight him for a minute, I mean, just such a brilliant, beautiful, like extraordinary voice and beating heart in the world. And he's offered so much. And I'm just so thankful in so many ways. And for many Buddhists I know, like actually learning some really key insights that Wilbur's been highlighting for 30, 40 years, I mean, would just save so many different preventable obstacles. Ideas like the conveyor belt, or the 3 strands of valid knowledge acquisition, or just in general, the basic all-qual theories, lines, levels, types, stages, quadrant, shadow. Those are contributions that like will go down in the annals of human history as being these synthesizing contributions that bring so much information in such dense, easy to use, practicable insights. I mean, it's just, you really like, there's so much extraordinary power in these specific key points. And part of that is, to your first part of your question, is that Rudra possibility. The Rudra possibility means when you use these higher ways of integrating more aspects, more systems, when all of a sudden you get the ability to like work with more systems simultaneously, you can also break the systems more quickly. Because now they're all interwoven or interlocked together, and you move one way and all of a sudden they all move that way, and if it's a bad move, they all have that ripple effect. And that's called Rudra, is when you intentionally use a technique that's actually can help enlightenment or liberation for yourself and other, for all beings. And instead of using it for that, you use it just for your own personal power. Now I'm going to dominate the whole web of Gaia, or whatever the version is. That's called Rudra, or Darth Vader move. And Buddha taught about that very specifically, and there's all kinds of guidelines in Buddhism that try to prevent that move. In Integral, the integral way of interfacing with Tibetan Buddhism, this says it as a key word, bodhicitta, heart mind of enlightenment. This is always only about mutual omni-win, game B, uplift of all beings here and now and everywhere forever. That's the basic bedrock view. You have to turn on when you do any Vajrayana anything. That is like resonantly true. Like without Zen or without bodhicitta, without the Bodhisattvayana path, Tantra Buddhism is not Vajrayana. It's just some techniques that move things in subtle ways really quickly. But it doesn't have the living view of bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is what prevents that Rudra kind of possibility, the Darth Vader move. And I really strongly think that's what will happen here with AI, just like it's already happened with humans. I mean, almost any dictator the world over has been good at integrating systems of systems. They've just been usually very low developed in specific lines, namely morality, empathy, like specific key lines. But they can integrate all these. They have very systematic views, oftentimes, these horrible beings that have caused so much damage and devastation. The question isn't how to get up into systems of systems. That's teal. The question is, how do you live that only for the benefit of self and other? And that's one fork. And that's what Buddhism says. You have to have that commitment, that bodhisattva vow. I'm only doing this for omni-benefit. And then systems of systems becomes the skillful means to have more good ripple out through all the systems more quickly, more thoroughly. But without that, it's so much easier to break it all quicker, as we're seeing. And once, we'll just see, as we've seen the last 50, 70 years, how quick, accessing fossil fuels to create plastics, to create all the things and luxuries that so-called first world people we enjoy, like this has broken a lot of planetary things in a generation. that it took, you know, hundreds of thousands of years to get to the point where we could do it all in about 50 years. So that only is going to get sped up, which is tough. It's a hard one. I have a like deep heartache for that.
And
But
that
I
is
think
our
it's also
challenge.
elegant. I think for integral, if we locate our integral meta mapping into lived ecologies of community, of bodies, of experience, of like local conditions, if we really have that meta theory really land in local lived conditions, like my life situation, then that life situation we have, if we really use our abilities and our heartfelt kind of care to like integrate that little small, tiny, little, almost imperceptible node of reality, if we integrate it more optimally, enhance it more lovingly, it's already interconnected with all these other nodes, all these other aspects of systems and communities, of neighborhoods, of cities. It already has this resonant connection. And we can basically sink into larger levels of community by really caring for this one here. But the idea of a top-down approach that I'll ever have the power to be the world president or the world dictator, and then if everyone just agrees with my things, we'll save the planet, that's not going to happen. And I'm glad it's not going to happen, because once you put that much power and centralize it in that way, all you need is a good person to pass away and a bad person to take over, and then the world's done for. It's just very fragile system. Like, I'm really not a fan of authoritarianism, and Buddhism in general is not either. They don't see the Buddha as a god or a king, as a dictator. They saw him as like a guide that you can use depending on what ecology you're in, what kind of embodiment you have. And if you're interested to curiously engage the kind of opportunities for experimentation, he said, try this if you want. If people want to, they try it and they see for themselves if it's helpful or not. And then they keep pursuing that if they find it to continually be helpful.
Thank you. And I just have one really quick practical question for you and Nomali. Have you considered, or are you considering, sponsoring a reading of your book through, say, the Integral Life program, where we read it chapter by chapter with you?
I'll answer that question super quickly, and then we'll go to Ulov. So Dragpa is going to start a series of calls, and depending on Dragpa's availability, he can do as many calls as he wants to. And I think he's going to bring in the book. But we haven't necessarily talked about a book group in the way that we have done SES or some of the other books. I think that's up to Dragpa. If Dragpa would like to lead that or would like to assign someone else to leading that, absolutely. Maybe Karen, if you want to, be the one who leads that, because I don't know how much time Dragpa has to lead his own book as a study group. But if Dragpa has the time and his community is good with that, that's absolutely an option. And Dragpa and I can talk about it offline and see.
Well, I would love it. I've got the book. I've skimmed through the Ken Wilber parts. I'm going to read it through. I haven't yet, but it wouldn't be the same without Dragpa.
Yes.
I respectfully, nice. Much as I would love to, I would respectfully decline the offer to lead a reading of Dragpa without Dragpa. It wouldn't be the same.
Okay, let's go to
I will read it in any case. Thank you.
Let's go to Ulov, since we have already gone beyond 2 hours.
Thank you. I don't have any question. I think I just want to voice my appreciation for you, Dragpa, and what you've done here. And I'm so grateful for. I feel more secure in what I'm doing with kind of playing around with shadow work, those components, and also being in Tibetan Buddhism kind of, and been dipping into Tantra and self-generation, and then like feel that what it's not clear to me that it's completely healthy, and what about the health with itself and so on. But you pointed so clearly that the healthy relative self is so important. So I feel more confident to work on that. And like, use the prayers and visualizations and shadow work, build on that, and then go further into the self-generation and so on. So that's one main thing that I heard from you today. I feel happy about that.
Yeah, thanks, Olive. Yeah, it's such a big nuanced topic. Healthy sense of self. I didn't cover it so much directly in the book. I mean, I included some quotes of great masters. I included some excerpts from Brene Brown. I included some examples of like healthy aspects of these different stages of modern, postmodern, pre-modern, all that. But if you look in like a lot of different Buddhist communities of all types, many of them are really actively incorporating different therapeutic modalities into their different dynamics, or they're experts themselves. That's their like day job. A lot of these teachers, they're like psychotherapists or professional therapists of various types. So honestly, I don't have any doubt that this part will be really covered in terms of different Buddhist approaches. I'm specifically not trained in any of that, and I have no expertise in any of that, scholastically, professionally, and I don't claim to. And that's a big part of why I didn't directly cover it very extensively in the book, because I don't have the skill set to cover that properly. So I defer to like other books that have done that, other teachers that do that very thoroughly, very actively. But in Buddhist frameworks, specifically all those foundational Buddhist teachings, that level of Four Noble Truths, like specifically they call them, if you're interested, the four mind turnings, the four ways you turn your mind towards the Dharma: preciousness of human embodiment with luxuries and freedoms, impermanence of all conditioned experience, the infallibility of cause, condition, and effect, or karma, and the fact that everything, any time we try to grab onto and fixate on any part of a moving integrated system causes suffering or distress. It's samsara. When we try to lock a moving system that's dynamical, when we actually try to freeze frame it, it causes this jolt of stress, this suffering. These 4 points, if we really give ourselves more time to like really get grounded in these 4 points, preciousness, impermanence, karma, and samsara, that will naturally have our mind and our heart orient towards Dharma, which is just a more healthy attunement or alignment with natural systems of cause, condition, and effect, where we actually want to use our time and our energy to like really care for others, care for the self, according to whatever's available and the readiness of like what a context provides. So it's vitally important. That's bedrock Buddhism. It has to be maintained. Bedrock Buddhism or essential means at all parts of the path, any moment we're doing something Buddhist, we have to activate and turn that on. It's nuts and bolts, always fundamentally a part of it. But if we stop there and only are kind of talking about just only self-enhancement, only personal security, only kind of making this safe space for me on my terms, then that breaks us from cause, condition, and effect. And then it causes a lot of these different kind of, you know, exaggerated self-absorption or overly kind of exaggerated self-importance, which is kind of really bedrock way to have a bad life. It really, once we put I constantly have to be happy, if that's the metric from a good life, it's going to be a pretty rough life. It's impossible to fulfill that.
Yeah. So the 4 mind turnings were a precious human life, karma, impermanence, and cause and effect.
Yep. Preciousness, impermanence, karma, samsara. If you look up 4 mind turnings in Buddhism, you'll find a ton of stuff on this. It's so rich. It's because it's foundational Buddhism. It's always incorporated.
Yeah, I clearly recognize those anyways. And then your point again with bodhicitta, so essential.
Exactly. Yeah. So essential. Without bodhicitta, without 4 foundations, Vajrayana is not Vajrayana. All these techniques existed before the Buddha in terms of visualization, pranayama, body postures. Those all existed before the Buddha. But his lines or teachings are on compassion, emptiness of all phenomena, impermanence of all conditioned experience. The fact that every being's nature is essentially like boundless, you know, wisdom and compassion. dedicating the merit. Anytime we do a positive thing, to like have like intentionally bring up a dedication of merit. By this act, may every single being be free from the causes of suffering. Those are all like lion's roar teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni. And so those are specific things that he added, that he said those are really invaluable, important aspects of an enlightenment path. He's not saying that's why every path has to have it, but like those are key features of the nature that he discovered in his investigation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I know it's long now, friends. I really appreciate like everyone really coming and kind of paying attention to all this time. I know it's like a lot, and it's a big book and it's complex topics, but any way we kind of make our lives any little bit more integrated, any little bit more bodhicittaful, like it is a beautiful offering to ourselves and to others. And I'm so thankful and grateful. I find in my experience, there's so many reasons to celebrate others. Like it's almost like I've kind of said I've like I feel like kind of almost like a cheerleader for people. Like it's so easy. It's so much easier for me to see so many good things. Like if I have to do a list of the awesome things of each person I see on the screen here, like already just today, I would be able to say things. Maybe not the people who I only see their names and I didn't hear anything from them, but everywhere else it's so easy there's so much to love in beings, actually. And if we really kind of like start with seeing what's lovable about others first, and then, okay, well, how can I build trusting kind of relationships or like at least good wishes for the beings? Then so many problems are prevented right off the bat. And so anytime I can do that, I'm thankful to myself when I do that and for others. And again, thanks to Namali, thanks to Integral Life, thanks for everyone showing up. And so, well, I know we'll line up a few meetings, at least a few sessions discussing some of the things in the book and probably some practices. And so, yeah, as a final note, in case anyone sees this later in the infinite time of internet existing, this very clearly is not trying to change Vajrayana Buddhism. I want to say that clearly. I'm not doing an update to Vajrayana. I'm just saying in my little understanding of very little study, very little practice of Tibetan Buddhism, there's many amazing things that I've discovered that I've just heard again and again from these lineage masters. And so I'm not trying to do a Dragpa version of Vajrayana. I'm just celebrating the little bit, the tiny little speck I know of Vajrayana Buddhism, and just saying if any of this is interesting to you, find someone who's actually an authoritative, like qualified teacher, really check them, investigate them thoroughly. They'll want you to. And then really, if you kind of see that they're a reliable guide, then really kind of like we need more turquoise people. We need more integration at every different part of the stack, every moment of existence. So every little bit we're doing, I really thank each of you for that. Thank you all.
Well, thank you so much, Dragpa. So many more questions to ask, but let's maybe have perhaps even a part 2. You do offer some challenges to the integral community in this book, and so hopefully maybe we can even have a part 2 and kind of really hear that from you. And really, I take that to heart and want to take that to heart. And as a community, we can hear that and learn from that and put it into practice. So, but for now, today feels like a good place to stop for now. Want to just also quickly say hi to Amanda. Amanda is Dragpa's beautiful wife, joining us today. So thank you, everyone. Anything anybody want to say? Something burning you want to say? No? Good. Okay. How about if you
I'll give 2 props here. Amanda's here, my awesome wife. Yeah, just stellar and integral in like countless ways, like literally let me count the ways. Like, I mean, so thankful for you, like pouring gratitude. Also, my twin brother, Andrew Cook, is here, who's like a little name on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned so many integral things from Andrew over the years, and us endlessly. How many decades we annoyed our parents talking about integral this and that at Thanksgiving dinners, and just like endlessly like integral this like constantly. But lots of love to you too, bro, and thanks for coming and all the ways you've helped me more creatively engage this, and I look forward to exploring all this with you all. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe we can all unmute ourselves and offer our goodbyes into the room, into the space. So thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you next time. Love you all. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
you.
Namali.
Till
Bye,
the next
everybody.
time.
Andrew and
Bye-bye.
Thank you both so much, all.
Bye-bye.